Hey guys, we're back for giving away the game. I'm joined by Ian, our gaming expert. How are you doing?
I'm good, Sam. How are you?
I'm great. So what are we talking about today?
We are talking about network effects, which are an incredibly important thing that is just not spoken about enough, to be honest. I know it's one of your favorite subjects. You've spoken to me about it plenty of times. So this should be an interesting conversation. I wanted to specifically talk about it in terms of the gaming world, because network effects is something that spoken about in regards to social media, in regards to big tech all the time, but people don't realize they're in games. So it's probably a good idea to define them before we get into anything else. And I think the simplest explanation is literally a network effect is when the value of a product or game or system increases exponentially, often for every new user of that thing. You can imagine the telephone network, for example. One person having a telephone on their own, good for them, but they can't call anyone. The network doesn't have much value. For every other person that has a phone that they can call, that the phone network is immediately more valuable. In games, obviously, social games like, I say social, Call of Duty, which are as social as competitively shooting people can be. The more people in the game, the more people on servers, the more fun you're going to have because there's more variety. But they are huge things. Often the network of something is more valuable than the thing itself. Social media is a great example. Social media, like Twitter, is sure technically fantastic and a great platform, but if you remade that today, you wouldn't be as successful because they have a network of users. They have a network of people contributing to the system. It's a fantastic thing. It's everywhere. And yeah, it's definitely worth diving into today.
All right. Yeah, absolutely. It's the kind of thing when you start understanding it and spotting it, you really see it everywhere, and especially in all successful companies. So let's get into it.
Exactly. So it's probably worth saying, first of all, that networks are generally better when they're dense. The more interconnected people are, the better. So the more other people that an individual person can connect to potentially, the better a network is going to be at generating value. So again, an online shooter where you can potentially connect to all other online players, that's a good, relatively dense network. But often networks aren't equally dense. You'll often have groups of sub-communities within each network which are very well connected, but they're sort of isolated from the rest of the group. Again, the phone network is a great example. While I have a phone and the president of Spain has a phone, I can't call the president of Spain as much as I want to. But I can call my friends. So I've got a dense network. The president of Spain probably has a dense network. I don't know what he's up to these days. But those don't really overlap too much. LinkedIn is a great example as well. LinkedIn directly shows you those groups, first connections, secondary connections, third degree. It shows there is some overlap, but they're separate entities. In the gaming world, that's very much an online multiplayer, an MMO type thing. You've got parties, you've got raiding groups, but generally those are the only people you'll interact with in a dense, very often way. Yeah, it's known as clustering. It's something that you want to encourage because it's going to provide more value more quickly. And there are ways that you can do that, which we'll get into later. I thought it would be good for us to try and break down different types of social network effects in games and the benefits they have, really. I think the social network is one that would be a great place to start. I'd love for you to chat about that, actually, Sam. So I know you're a big advocate of network effects and sharing the knowledge.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting about network effects is that it's a truly a good way to build defensibilities, basically. As you've said, now companies do not compete only with their tech because everyone can build platform. It's a matter of throwing resources at it. It's about the network that you're building. And as you said, it's especially true in games. So there are games where the more users you have, the more valuable the game is. Every MMO is like that. Every multiplayer is like that. And so the game developers are trying to build mechanics to further build on these network effects and make sure that when users join the network, they are likely to increase the value of the game as a whole.
Exactly. And the biggest way is the social network that games have. We've alluded to this in the conversation already, and it's something that everyone who plays games has probably encountered at some point. And we're not talking about social network in the same way as Facebook and Twitter, although they are excellent examples. We're talking about most social interaction, and that would be online players and stuff like that. A lot of mobile games use this because mobile games are becoming more and more social because it's more accessible. Someone who's very knowledgeable about Facebook, they'll be happy to use the social features in a game because it's common, it's recognizable, it's friendly. So the social networks in games are often talking to friends. So chat rooms, it's often competing against other people. It's often being in groups with other people. Alliances in Game of War is a good example. Those are groups of 100 people, which are big, dense clusters, but they're still social. They still have all of the social elements of a social network, but they're just in a gaming context. And this also comes into things like Candy Crush, where you can request lives or give lives to your friends. That's a particularly interesting one for me because it's playing on this idea of, what's the term? I think it's selfish altruism or selfish kindness. So there's this idea that there are no selfless good acts. Every good thing you do is to get some sort of benefit. Often that benefit is feeling nice. When you help someone, you feel good. It's as simple as that. And Candy Crush is a good example because when you give your lives to someone else and it helps them win, you feel like a good friend. And that reinforces your connection, both socially and to the game. You associate the game with good feelings, so you want to invest more into it and you want to share it. And although on that sharing point, it's probably good to talk about the difference between a network effect and a virality effect. Do you want to cover that one?
Sure. So this is a good point because it's on that outlook, it can look kind of similar, but it's actually very different. So virality is about how many users each existing user can invite. So if you have a viral system, you have your users are doing user acquisition for you. They refer friends, and these friends are joining the platform. So that can work very well, but that doesn't mean that each new user is contributing positively to make the experience more valuable for the other users. For example, Farmville is it used to be a very viral game. You could invite friends and mainly using Facebook. So they were able to acquire a lot of users this way, but the network effects there was still pretty weak because each new user in Farmville was not providing much value to the others. So it's very important to differentiate the two. And you can, of course, do both. And in the case that you mentioned, where in Candy Crush, where you can invite friends or gift them something, then it also helps acquiring new users outside of the app. But these users, when they join, they become part of that ecosystem, and they are also likely to interact, to gift, points and things to other users, which makes the overall experience more valuable. So you can mix the two, definitely, but they're different things.
Absolutely. So back on social networks quickly, I wanted to highlight just how important they are by talking about .io games, which is a genre in its own, generally massively multiplayer experiences. Very much, they're viral because they're shareable and playable in browser, but they are huge network events because it's meant to be completely other people, completely multiplayer, completely online, completely digestible. But these started on 4chan with, I can't remember the first one, but super popular. Everyone shared it around. It became a genre of its own. And the multiplayer element of it was so important, the social network element, the feeling that you were part of a bigger group or a bigger online thing. became such a staple of the genre as a whole that they started faking it. You can see a lot of videos and essays about this online, but there is this whole huge range of games that have fake opponents that they're pretending are real. They've got fake usernames, they've got AI behaviors to make it seem like they're real people. But completely, if you turn off your Wi-Fi, the game ends. The game doesn't end, sorry, because it's not connected to the internet. You're not playing against anyone. They're just ghosts.
Sometimes it just loads, like you join these matches with like 20 other people and it loads immediately and it almost feels too good to be true. And there's no other mechanics to actually talk to these guys. So it's definitely a way to create this sense of community while you're probably playing against the bot.
Exactly. And that's this to me is a great display of how valuable network effects are to both players and businesses. To players, this feeling that you are a part of a network, or at least playing against real people, is so important that the business feels the need to fake it just to draw people in. For the business, it's so crucial to display it like a peacock's feathers that, and we'll go into this later, but it's important to display it because having a network effect often helps you get new users. It's probably good to talk about that now, actually. The network effects on acquisition are very interesting. There's sort of a twofold element to it, and this plays into our virality chat as well. The bigger a games network is, on one level, the easier it is to gain more players just because your peacock featherage is bigger. It's easy to say that your game is popular and that more people should play it because it's got a player base. So many people are playing it, it must be good, right? It's a virtuous cycle, essentially, and it leads to incredibly cheap acquisition because you can run these campaigns that aren't very targeted, but often they don't necessarily represent the gameplay that you have in your game, as you can see in the hyper-casual genre. But just by touting the fact that they've got X amount of players, however 100,000, however million, people see that as social proof. This game must be good. Secondly, cross-promotion.
Definitely helps if that's true, though. Because
it does.
That's one of the really interesting things. Just a quick note on that is that you can't really fake a network effect. That's what makes it defensible, right? The fact that Google or Facebook are so defensible is because we could replicate the tech, we could replicate pretty much everything but the network that they have built. And the fact that this is impossible to replicate, that's the defensibility. That's what takes time for other players to try to catch up with, and what make them at the top of the market for all this time. So when people say all these companies are too strong, they're impossible to compete with, what they're really saying is their network effects are too strong. The network is so strong, even if Facebook is not the best social network in terms of features, it doesn't matter because everyone is on there. The switching costs are just massive. It's impossible to compete anymore. So it's while you can fake it, try to kind of speed up maybe some acquisition to then get featured on the organic store and get some organic downloads there. At the end of the day, it's something that is really, really hard to fake. You can't really fake the density of your network.
No, you really can't. And people can tell, like you often, back when I used to play games a lot, people would know if there was a bot playing or someone using aim bots or anything like that, just because it's so different. And that does ruin the experience a little bit. As soon as you know these aren't real people, I'm not part of anything, I'm not part of a network. As a player, it feels awful and you're out of it. As an onlooker, it just looks a bit sad on the business side that they're having to pretend. The other big benefit of network effects in acquisition for cross-promoting games. The more players in your game, the more people you can advertise other games you've made to. And this is, again, very common in the hyper-casual genre where they pass over players. That way, you're not breaking your publisher-wide network. You're just moving a player from one dense node, which is an individual game, into another dense node, and you're really getting a lot of long-term value from them in terms of monetization. It's one of the biggest ways that publishers like Ketchup or Voodoo are becoming so popular. They're not building networks in an individual game, although they do exist. They are building publisher-wide networks. They've got this really big macro view of their business and the people that use it, the players, that they're just playing a bigger game, really. You can think of it as Google as well. Google have this huge overreach, and on that overreach, they've got networks in Google Chrome and Google phones and every other business they own. It's like a puppet master with a lot of strings. Maybe not a perfect analogy.
It's pretty good. Yeah. I think, this is why hyper-casual publishers are not bothered about the short lifespan of their games, right? The game works for a bit. It doesn't. Users are leaving, but they're going somewhere else. So it's really, they're growing a network. They're not growing a game. If you start thinking of it this way, it makes perfect sense. But there's a really interesting analogy with things outside of games, and it's the perfect network effect is actually a city. Why are people coming to London or to New York more than the countryside? Well, that's because there's just more activity there. There's more things to do. There's probably more jobs. You get paid more. You have restaurants all across your streets. Life is easier. And so more people are coming, and they create jobs for others as well, which attracts more and more people. So it's the true network effect, where you can see how, why more and more people are coming to cities, right? And reversing that effect is just harder and harder, because every person that comes to the city makes it slightly more valuable. Now, sometimes it can get capped at some point, and that's probably true in games as well. If you have 1 million people playing, if you were able to have 1 million people in one game of League of Legends, it would be unplayable, right? So the network effect would start to undo itself. But this is why they're controlling it and breaking it down in different rooms. So it's really interesting. Once you start really understanding the process, you can see that it happens at different levels, so very small levels, company levels, but also the level of the world to some extent. Yeah, it's
interesting that you brought up too many players creating problems for networks as well. I was doing some research into this for this article, and World of Warcraft kept coming up, because you probably heard about it back when it happened, but the World of Warcraft economy, the in-game currency that they use of items and gold, it hit a recession a couple of years ago, because they were getting so many new players that the value of gold was dropping rapidly, because it's a renewable, easy resource. Mm-hmm. So every individual item had to cost more for every new player that joined, because there was more gold being added to the economy, but the value of items wasn't changing. So all the items change in value. Situations like that are where the more dense a network is, the more individual nodes in that network, the more you kind of do need to be conscious of macro effects of that. Same with the city. You have to be careful. The government has to be careful about making sure the economy doesn't tank, making sure the roads are safe, making sure the actual systems of that network are functional and can support that many players. There's an infrastructure side to a network, which we're not going to talk about today, but often it's server costs, often it's usability. It's just as important. And it's something that we'll probably get into when we talk about building a network affecting games, which again, not today, but probably something we should cover.
Yeah. There's also different types of effects that, again, it's a bit too detailed, but if your network is embedded within the technology itself, like the telephone, for example, that's a very, very strong network effect. Facebook has very strong network effects, or WhatsApp even, which is very similar to the telephone one. And then as you kind of move away from that center, you have effects like marketplaces, which is when you have buyers and sellers, like in eBay, for example. The more sellers you have, the more buyers you will attract, which will generate more revenue for the sellers and vice versa. But because there are two different types of people, you have the demand side, the supply side, that makes it more disjointed. And so adding more buyers does not make it more valuable for the buyers. It just makes it more valuable for the sellers. So you can see that it's it doesn't benefit the whole network, only half of it. So it's less defensible. And then you can go out and out and out. And then you have data network effects, which I'm sure you will talk about in a bit, which are also very important. But of course, less important than the physical network effects, like the line of the telephone, for example.
Absolutely. And I will get onto data network effects in a second. I wanted to briefly touch on monetization because it's worth acknowledging. It's cropped up once or twice, but might as well acknowledge the elephant in the room. Network effects can drastically affect a game's revenue in a lot of ways. There's a social element to it. There's a social pressure element to it as well. Game of War Fire Age is a good example. It's my go-to at least, because the alliances in that game are very interesting on a gameplay mechanic and a gameplay level. It's a group of 100 players, I think it is. You join it, and you kind of have to join it because it's the only way for you to compete, essentially. It is a social network, as I said before. Players in an alliance can research and buy boosts to benefit the overall team. And it's only the teams that are really cohesive and work really well together and spend a lot of money as a group that actually win at the game. I was reading through a lot of Game of War forums the other day, and there was this one player who was very, very famous, and he had won and his clan, his alliance, had won the game for several years in a row. And he had spent many hundreds of thousands of dollars on it. But the forums were all they weren't talking about the money. They were talking about this sense of accomplishment as a team. They were talking about how much everyone worked together and how they elected this one player to be the king of the game, essentially. And it's really fascinating from a sociology perspective. Not a conversation for today, but it goes to show how much the social pressure of not letting your side down matters in terms of monetization and obviously the dense network that you're a part of.
Massively, yeah. And of course, creating network effects between users, making each user more valuable to others, means that if you enable it in your game, you can create some kind of commerce between users. So, it's not only them buying your power-ups or your in-app purchase, it's themselves doing commerce with each other, on which you can take commissions. So creating these networks and enabling transactions, again, it's very similar to the city example that I've mentioned. You have a lot of platforms such as Second Life and now similar VR platforms that I know for a fact when they design their environments, they think about network effects. How can we enable people to talk to each other, because that would generate obviously some kind of financial transaction at some point. So bringing network effect as part of the product conversation is key. It's not something that you can plug on top. It needs to be part of your service.
I wonder if these conversations are really. I know not a lot of game developers necessarily know about network effects, but they might not
know it as by name, but a lot of them know what would make a game successful, and it generally ends up being network effects. So even if they can't pinpoint what it actually is or the reasons for it, it's pretty clear that building a network that enables people to communicate and makes it more valuable is what creates defensibilities.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly where I was going with it. I think there's a power to knowing the name for it, even though it's this, inherently known design principle. Let's talk about data for a second, because I think data is a big part of this conversation. And when you acknowledge that you are building a network, you are trying to create a network effect, it sort of keys you into how important data is. So obviously we're living in a world of data. Everything is data now. You are data, if you wanted to get dramatic with it. The more players that join a game, the more publishers get access to data about those players. And for every player, their database of just pure information grows, again, exponentially. For everything from marketing preferences, which everyone talks about with the Facebook pixel, to just general user behavior, to everything about an individual person. I know you were talking today, Sam, about people having a behavioural fingerprint in VR games.
Yeah.
Like you can track the movement of an individual's head and hands, and you can predict if that person is in another game purely by the way they move.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's absolutely crazy. And this data is so powerful. Pure information is so powerful that it lets you optimize things like monetization, like your marketing, like gameplay mechanics from a design perspective. Anything you could want, you can use data to optimize it in some way. And every new user gives you a little bit more insight into that thing. But the real power of data comes into when advertisers are considered, because advertisers love data more than anything else. It is their chocolate, which is the most important thing to me, at least.
Right.
Yeah. Advertisers want data more than anything in the world because that lets them know that their marketing outreach in every sense is effective. They want to target people. They want to target their customers, their consumers. And when a mobile games company has data that tells them we have the people you want to see, that's incredibly financially valuable. Even beyond the social value of a network in itself, the financial value on top of that for advertisers is exponential. It's huge. That is why Google and Facebook have a 70% ownership of the world's ad spend.
Yeah, massively, absolutely. That's the interesting part about Google, mainly where all of their business, everything they do from search to Android and Gmail and all the other documents that they have, all of these are entry points for you to enter your data, which then helps them sell more targeted advertising on Google search. So this is why they're able to obviously provide all this stuff for free. It's not actually free, as everyone knows. If you think it's free, it's because you're paying with your data. And definitely that, again, having able to capture literally hundreds of data points about every individual makes it really, really hard for anyone else to catch up, especially when probably 70% of the time that you spend online, you are using Google service. And so every day you are actually giving them more and more data points. So not only they have the most data points across the whole industry, but that advantage is even increasing faster than the competition. Absolutely. And that's why they're so valuable. This is what we talked about before. Truly, the value of Google and Facebook is in their network effect.
Does that mean you feel uncomfortable that you are pure data, pure numbers to a company like Google?
I mean, I think it's better to try to be comfortable with it, because it is what it is. There's no way to fight it, unless you want to leave totally offline, which is not really an option. It's not going to get any better, in my opinion. We've mentioned virtual reality. We mentioned new technology. These are just going to enable more types of data to be able to be captured. Maybe it's not going to be stuff like your name or your address or your preferences, but it's going to be more behavioral data, where you look, how long you look at things, how does looking at this virtual thing make me feel. You can actually figure that out with pupillometry, which just measures the diameter of your pupils, which basically is directly related to your emotions. Also gait analysis, which is based on how you move, you leave that unique kinetic fingerprint through time. It's just crazy what can be done there, and that stuff it's not something we're working on, by the way. This is just research. It will need to be regulated. The regulators they don't even know that this is happening. So again, to tie back to our conversation right now, the data that Google and Facebook have is a lot of static data, is stuff that doesn't change all the time. It's your name, it's your browsing history and stuff like that. But when you start bringing behavioral data, which changes as you go, as you walk in the street or perform any kind of action, then that becomes real time. And technologies like augmented reality, if you wear the computer on your face, will be able to measure that at every single time. So in terms of privacy, I think it's better to make peace with the fact that that's gone. But at the same time, if it's regulated well and if it's used for non-criminal activities, at the end of the day, the value exchange is positive. I want to have access to these new technologies. I want to have access to free internet. And if I need to pay with my data, and if it's secure and used for companies that do nothing more than targeting ads at me, I'm okay with that. I think, it's all about the value exchange and what you're willing to pay to access all these services.
Very, very well put. It's one of those things that I can't help but be terrified by.
It is terrifying. That's for sure.
But
that's for sure.
It's sort of the ticket price to the future. I don't think we can. The knee-jerk response is that it's a negative thing, and it is scary and it is huge. But we really have to see how regulations progress. We have gone on a huge tangent here, and it's very interesting. But let's bring it back to network effects quickly by talking about the likely owners of that behavioral data, Google and Facebook, the ones that own 70% of the ad share of the world, as we've mentioned. They are titans. They are Goliaths in this space. And you have to ask yourself, how can mobile companies compete with something like that? How can they look at Google and not quiver in their boots and let them eat the village goats, if we're talking about David and Goliath? I don't know. Again, metaphors are hard.
Yeah, I like the chocolate one better.
Oh, thank you. The answer to how a mobile company can compete is with networks. Networks are that powerful. And it's why we've seen so many mergers and acquisitions late already this year, even though we're in quarantine. It's such an important thing that it just can't be stopped. And yes, the gaming industry hasn't been slowed down much by quarantine, but it's the networks and data that are really becoming huge now. And that's why everything is rushing forward. Let's talk about Machine Zone and AppLovin. AppLovin purchased Machine Zone. They made Game of War Fire Age, which we've spoken about today. And Game of War has this incredibly powerful network, which is very valuable. Machine Zone was valued at $5
billion, yeah. A few years ago.
Incredibly high price, and that is entirely on the value of their network. AppLovin managed to get that down to 500 million, which
pretty good
incredible deal.
Yeah.
But the fact that they sought that out and they did that, they made that acquisition, is purely to eventually reach that, eventually be able to compete with Google and Facebook. Not in terms of, revenue or straight users or anything like that.
Yeah,
exactly. And it's completely in terms of owning this ad space, owning the mobile game network, and owning that network, owning the network itself.
In the games, yeah, absolutely. And actually, you can make that conversation more generic and ask yourself why player A acquired player B. And it's pretty much all about the networks. I mean, Facebook acquired Instagram because their Facebook on mobile at the time was not doing too well, and they could see that a new network was being built on mobile. They acquired it. Why did they pay 19 billion for WhatsApp, which is, a chat app? Obviously, that can be built in a week. Like, maybe not the same level of security, but it's not that complicated. The value is not in the tech; it's in the network. And more than anyone, Mark Zuckerberg understands that power. In fact, you have early transcripts of him when he was building Facebook in 2004, where he's already talking about that. And you can see that he's engineering his product to maximize the network effects in there, which is what every tech founder should be doing, because that is what makes it valuable. So yeah, no, absolutely. This is what, this is the network is what powers the desire for companies to acquire each other, because again, it's very hard and long to build. If you can acquire it, integrate it, and merge it with your own network, then it's extremely valuable. And again, it's also why startups get investments most of the time. Early stage startup like we are now, or we were a few years ago, investors look at potential revenue, of course, but it's really, really hard to estimate when you're just 1 year old, you have a couple of people, You might be pre-revenue, making a couple of hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's really hard to see, could this go to $1 billion or just 100 million? So how do they assess the potential value of the company? A lot of it is by figuring out how defensible the company is going to be, how much time you're going to have to get to that level without someone else stepping and taking over effectively, even a big player. And how do you build defensibilities? By having a strong network. So, but the interesting thing there, it's like investors would not tell you that. So it's almost like this hidden secret that I don't think a lot of early founders know about. That's what the VCs, when they evaluate them, look at, even if they don't tell you what are your network effects. What they're trying to assess in their mind is how defensible is it going to be? How easy is it going to be for anyone, including Google and Facebook, to copy them? Or is it going to be too hard to copy that these big players would rather acquire them? And again, AdMob, first mobile ad network, technology was great, but not anything that Google couldn't have built, of course. Why did they buy them? Because they had about 50% of the mobile traffic. They could reach 50% of the users that had mobile in the early days. And so it's just easier for Google to purchase it rather than rebuilding it from scratch. So again, just a quick bit of advice here for the tech founders. Look into network effects more and try to use that to inform product decisions. And when you talk to a VC or investor, put it up front. Have a slide in your deck that is about network effects, how you're going to build defensibility to maximize the value of your company.
Valuable stuff. If I ever become a tech startup, which I probably won't be, I will definitely.
Never say never. No, you know about the network effects. So
that's true. I've got the hidden secret. Let's quickly, as a final point, to put a nice little bow on this. I think it's important to just talk about the future, and then we'll wrap it up. So I put this question to you, Sam. Are network effects going anywhere? Are they going to become less important?
No, definitely not. Like network effects it's a natural thing, right? Creating a network, enabling transaction or communication between people. It's not something that is, a function of time. It's not something that is going to go away. Again, it's this thing when people say the rich are getting richer, when we can see that everything is consolidating towards the big players in any market, any industry. That is, again, a description of network effects. That is what it is. It's when everything you add makes it more valuable, which attracts more and more things. So definitely, I think the more technology there is, the more valuable and the easiest you can build network effects. In fact, before the internet, the network effects were not really a thing. It's very hard to build network effects in the offline world. The telephone is one of them, but you know how much it costs to put this, lines of phones together. It's not something that anyone can build. And at the time, scale was the biggest defensibility, which is why when the internet actually came out, these big companies, say like advertising companies that did not use the internet, didn't believe that advertising was going to be built on the internet. They thought, we have the scale, we talk to all the advertisers. They didn't have the network effects. Now it's different. Google, Facebook, they have built network effects. It's honestly really hard for me to imagine in my lifetime a world where these companies would not be important, because what they can't build, they can acquire. No, and it's just such a different order of magnitude to the rest of the market that it's really, really difficult to imagine these platforms, their networks actually decreasing in power. It could happen. So examples, Facebook right now, it's not doing too well. There's a lot of bad PR about it. People are talking about leaving it. Finally, advertisers are actually putting spend out of the platform, which is what is making Facebook tick and actually make some changes. So it's not that it's set in stone forever. It's just that the scale of it and the network is so strong that it's going to take a lot of effort to replace that.
It's very true. It's a necessary and, well, not necessarily necessary, but it's such an ingrained part of our culture right now that, these companies are thriving off of it. I think there is, if we were to put a single a single thing, if we were to say a single thing for people to watch and look at in this space, especially in the gaming space, it is that people are trying to compete with Google and Facebook's ad spend, and they're doing a pretty damn good job. The size of Google and Facebook is immense as businesses. They are intimidating, huge behemoths, but the power of a network is in its dense, smaller clusters, and the mobile gaming cluster is fighting back. I'm excited to see what happens, even if
Absolutely.
What happens is Google purchasing all of the mobile game companies.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's
great.
Yeah, that's it.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, guys, for listening. Please make sure to follow us at Admix Play, and see you again next week.